All right, so today let's dive into feminist aesthetics.
Yeah.
I think especially for someone like yourself with a background in philosophy,
Yeah.
this will be really fascinating. We're going to be looking at some excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, kind of exploring its key concepts and hopefully uncovering maybe some surprising connections.
Yeah, it's funny because when you say feminist aesthetics, it's not like you're talking about a specific style of art, like saying something is impressionist or Baroque.
Right.
Feminist aesthetics is really more of a critical lens that we can use to look at, how gender influences art.
So it's less about saying, oh, this painting is feminist art.
Exactly.
It's more about asking, like, how have ideas about gender shaped the way we see and understand art in, across history?
Exactly. And, when you start to ask that question, you realize there's a lot going on beneath the surface. For example, the encyclopedia entry talks about how even the concept of fine art has been, historically gendered. Almost like the whole category was, designed with a certain type of artist in mind, and that artist, more often than not, was not a woman.
That's such an interesting point, and I think as someone who spent a lot of time thinking about philosophical questions, I can already see how this connects to these bigger ideas about power and, representation and who gets to define these categories that we use to understand the world.
Absolutely. I mean, and that's where things get even more interesting because for centuries, the Western art world has put fine art, things like painting and sculpture and classical music on a pedestal, while at the same time devaluing craft.
Mm-hmm.
And craft was often, the kinds of work that were traditionally associated with women, like textiles and pottery and intricate needlework.
Okay.
Things were seen as, merely functional, not really, intellectual enough to be considered fine art.
Yeah, it's almost like women's creativity was being deliberately shoved into these predetermined boxes
Right.
that were then conveniently dismissed as less important.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. I mean, it's like the game was rigged from the start. And, if that wasn't enough, you also had societal norms that made it even more difficult.
Yeah.
Imagine being a woman in like the 18th or 19th century with these, artistic aspirations.
Yeah.
Putting your work out there for public consumption was seen as deeply unfeminine.
Right.
So even if you had the talent, just the act of pursuing art professionally was fraught with all this social stigma.
Wow, it's amazing how these seemingly small things like what we even call art or what's considered appropriate for women can have such a huge impact on the entire history of art.
It really is. And what I find really fascinating is how contemporary feminist art practices are pushing back against these historical biases.
Right.
So artists today are reclaiming those traditional craft materials and techniques, textiles, ceramics, all of that.
Yeah.
And they're eliciting them to the realm of fine art. They're also exploring themes that were previously considered taboo, things like motherhood and female sexuality, and really challenging that traditional art world focus.
It's like they're not just making art, they're rewriting the rules of the game.
Exactly.
And speaking of rewriting the rules, the encyclopedia entry also dives into this idea of genius.
Yeah.
And how it's been used to kind of exclude women from the artistic canon.
Yeah.
I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this.
It's so interesting how traditional views of artistic genius framed it as this, distinctly masculine trait.
Right.
But here's the paradox. They often describe this male artistic genius using metaphors that were rooted in feminine experiences. So you think about words like conception or gestation or birth, all these terms that are tied to the act of creation.
Right.
But women, the ones literally giving birth, were somehow excluded from this category of genius.
It seems almost contradictory, right?
It is.
On the one hand, you have this elevation of male creative power.
Yeah.
But it's expressed through this language that, appropriates this very essence of feminine creation.
Yeah.
It's like taking ownership of the creative act while simultaneously, denying women's full participation in it.
Exactly. And that raises a really important question for feminist thinkers. What do we do with this concept of genius? Is it so inherently patriarchal that it needs to be just rejected outright?
Yeah.
Or can we maybe unearth this feminine genius tradition that has been overlooked or misinterpreted?
Yeah, those are some big questions. And there are no easy answers, are there?
Right.
But I can already see how this line of questioning really forces us to think about, whose voices have been amplified and whose have been silenced throughout history, and how that's really shaped our understanding of what constitutes artistic brilliance.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And these critiques of, genius and fine art, they're not just these abstract philosophical debates. They have real-world implications for how we experience and engage with art. In fact, the entry even suggests that museums, could benefit from shifting their focus away from this traditional hierarchy that centers this individual genius in his masterpiece.
So instead of just like, a series of masterpieces on white walls, what if we had exhibits that celebrated that collaborative creativity that's always been present,
Right.
especially in the work that was, traditionally done by women?
That's exactly the kind of radical shift that, feminist thinkers like Hilda Hein propose.
Yeah.
By challenging that traditional focus, we can create space for a much more inclusive and diverse understanding of what art is and who gets to be considered an
It's
artist.
like democratizing the art world, right?
Exactly.
Making it more accessible and relevant to a wider range of experiences.
Exactly. And, that's something that we can explore further as we continue this deep dive. And, when we talk about everyday experiences, it's fascinating how even abstract concepts like beauty and sublimity, those, cornerstones of aesthetic theory, get all tangled up with gendered assumptions.
Yeah, it's like those ideas about what's masculine and what's feminine, they seep into the very way we perceive and experience art.
Right.
Right. So, for example, you have beauty often linked to qualities like delicacy and grace and even fragility traits that are traditionally associated with femininity.
Right.
And then on the other side, you have sublimity, which is often evoked by like vast and powerful and even terrifying aspects of nature
Right.
that's coded as more masculine.
Exactly. And it makes me think about this emphasis on disinterested pleasure in 18th century aesthetics,
Yeah.
which might actually be masking a distinctly masculine heterosexual perspective.
Okay, now that's a concept that I've always found a little bit puzzling.
Yeah.
Can you help me unpack this idea of disinterested pleasure? What exactly does it mean?
Well, the basic idea is that to truly appreciate beauty, you need to detach yourself from any personal desires or interests. So it's about achieving this purely contemplative state free from, things like hunger or even sexual desire.
But isn't that kind of unrealistic, especially when you consider how women were often positioned as like the objects of aesthetic appreciation? It
Right.
creates this strange paradox, doesn't it?
It absolutely
Yeah.
does. Women were expected to embody beauty, but they were also supposed to be capable of appreciating it from this supposedly neutral, disinterested standpoint. So it's
Right.
like they were being asked to somehow step outside of their own lived experience to conform to a standard that was, inherently biased against them.
That's such a fascinating point. And as a philosopher, I'm always interested in how these seemingly objective concepts actually contain all sorts of hidden assumptions.
Yeah.
It makes me wonder, if disinterested pleasure is so problematic, how many other seemingly neutral aesthetic ideas are actually loaded with these kinds of implicit biases?
That's a great question, and it's one that feminist aesthetics is constantly probing. And, while it might be impossible to completely escape these ingrained ways of seeing, I think becoming aware of them allows us to engage with art in a more, critical and nuanced way.
Right. So even if we can't fully detach ourselves from those societal influences, at least we can acknowledge that they're there and start to think about how they might be shaping our perceptions.
Exactly. And speaking of, challenging those traditional ways of seeing, let's talk about the concept of the male gaze, which has been incredibly influential in understanding how visual art often positions the viewer from a masculine perspective and potentially objectifying women in the process.
Ah, the male gaze is such a powerful concept, especially in film theory.
Right.
And it really exposes those power dynamics that are often embedded in the act of looking.
Right.
But, I'm curious, do you think the gaze itself is inherently gendered? I mean, do women look at art in the same way that men do?
That's a great question, and it's one that feminist theorists have debated extensively. The male gaze theory doesn't necessarily claim that all men look at art in the same way or that women are incapable of adopting a male gaze. The point is that the way we look at art and the world around us is profoundly shaped by our social conditioning.
Right.
And in patriarchal societies, that often means internalizing a male perspective that can reduce women to objects of visual consumption.
It's a bit unsettling when you think about it, right? How many masterpieces have we all admired without even realizing the subtle ways they might be reinforcing these gendered power structures?
Right, it makes you re-examine those canonical works in a whole new light. And,
Mhm.
while the male gaze theory has been debated and refined over the years, I think the core insight remains incredibly valuable looking, is never a neutral act.
Hmm.
It's always informed by our experiences, our values, and yes, our gender.
Absolutely.
Yep.
It's like feminist aesthetics is giving us this new set of lenses through which to view the world, helping us see those power dynamics that were always there but maybe hidden in plain sight.
Precisely. And it's not just about, analyzing the problem, it's about actively creating solutions. And that's where feminist art practices themselves have played such a crucial role in disrupting and redefining the art world.
Yeah, they're not just talking about change, they're making it happen. And that takes us back to those challenges to the traditional definitions of art, right? Those pushes against the values of the art world and even the questioning of beauty itself.
Yes, think about the early feminist art movements of the 1970s, with their willingness to tackle taboo subjects and make these bold political statements. Judy Chicago's The Dinner Party, for example, is a great example of how feminist art can be both visually striking and intellectually challenging.
Right, that massive installation celebrating female figures throughout history, it really forced people to confront their own assumptions about women and art and even the human body. I can only imagine the conversations that it sparked.
It was groundbreaking, and then you have the emergence of post-feminist art, which builds on these earlier foundations, but often with a more playful and ironic and self-aware approach.
Okay, so what exactly distinguishes post-feminist art? How is it different from those earlier feminist movements?
Well, post-feminist art often delves into themes of gender fluidity,
Yeah.
the deconstruction of traditional categories and the complex relationship between identity and representation. Think of artists like Cindy Sherman, whose photographs explore the constructed nature of female identity, or Kiki Smith, who uses a variety of media to investigate the female body and its place in society.
So it's less about making like explicit political statements and more about exploring the nuances and complexities of gender in a, postmodern world.
Exactly. It's like they're saying, we're not going to shy away from the messiness of gender and identity, and
Yeah.
we're going to use art to explore these themes in all their multifaceted glory.
That's a really interesting distinction. And it seems like a natural progression, right? As feminist ideas become more integrated into the mainstream,
Mhm.
the art itself becomes more nuanced and multifaceted.
I think you're right, and this brings us to another central theme in feminist aesthetics, the body in art and philosophy.
Yes, and it's not just about depicting the female form in new ways. It's about understanding how our lived experience as embodied beings, shaped by gender and other social factors, influences our relationship with art and the world around us.
You put it perfectly. Feminist art and philosophy have challenged that traditional mind-body dualism that we often see in Western thought, which tends to relegate the body to a secondary role in aesthetic theory. Instead, they've brought the body to the forefront, exploring its materiality, its sensuality, and its capacity for both pleasure and pain.
And this reevaluation of the senses has been particularly fascinating. When you say, for so long, aesthetics was primarily concerned with sight and sound, those higher senses, while neglecting the so-called lower senses, like taste and touch and smell.
Absolutely. Those senses were considered too bodily, too subjective, too messy for, serious aesthetic inquiry. But feminist artists and philosophers have really turned that hierarchy on its head, using food and scent and even disgust to create these powerful and thought-provoking art experiences.
It's like they're saying, hey, all of our senses contribute to our understanding of art and the world, so let's not pretend otherwise.
Precisely. And this emphasis on the body extends to the exploration of previously taboo subjects like menstruation and childbirth and even bodily fluids.
It's like all of a sudden those aspects of, female experience that were kind of hidden away or considered, too private or even repulsive are being brought into the light and, explored as legitimate subjects for art.
Exactly. And artists like Karen Finley, for example, have really pushed the boundaries here, using their own bodies and all sorts of unconventional materials to confront audiences with these raw, visceral aspects of being a woman.
Yeah, I remember reading about Finley's work, how she used, blood and chocolate and other materials that some people found, shocking or even disgusting. Was that part of her point, to provoke those reactions?
Absolutely. She wanted to challenge those, idealized and sanitized images of the female body that we see so often in art and popular culture by incorporating these elements that were traditionally considered taboo. She was forcing people to confront their own discomfort and re-examine their assumptions about what's considered acceptable or beautiful.
It's so interesting. It's like she's using disgust as a tool to kind of disrupt our expectations and make us, reconsider our own ingrained biases.
Precisely. And this ties into the larger feminist project of reclaiming the female body and its experiences from the confines of patriarchal control.
Yeah.
It's about asserting that these experiences are valid, they're worthy of artistic expression, and they deserve to be seen and heard.
That's such a powerful statement. It makes me think about how feminist aesthetics can be so challenging. It's not just about looking at pretty pictures. It's about confronting these uncomfortable truths
Yeah.
about ourselves and the society we live in.
You're absolutely right. And this is where the philosophical side of feminist aesthetics gets really interesting. Thinkers like Luce Irigaray and Julia Kristeva, for example, have had a huge impact on how we think about art and the body through a feminist lens.
Right. I remember encountering Irigaray's work in my philosophy studies. Her concept of a sexuate perspective is so challenging, but also really rewarding if you can wrap your head around it.
I agree. It's not easy reading, but it forces us to confront how deeply our language and our thought patterns are shaped by this patriarchal worldview. And Kristeva's concept of objection has been really insightful for understanding, those works of art that deal with disgust and horror and the body.
As a philosopher, I've always been fascinated by Kristeva's work.
Yeah.
It's amazing how she takes these experiences that we usually try to avoid,
Hmm.
the messy, the repulsive, the abject, and shows how they can actually be sources of, profound insight.
It's brilliant, isn't it, she argues, that these experiences, which often involve a blurring of boundaries between the self and the other, can be both repulsive and fascinating. They can challenge our sense of order and control, but they can also lead to a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
It makes me think about those moments in art that kind of make you want to look away and lean in closer at the same time.
Yeah.
There's something so compelling about those works that make us confront those, dark, messy aspects of human existence.
Exactly. And feminist artists have been particularly adept at using these unsettling emotions to create works that challenge those traditional notions of beauty and good taste.
Hmm.
They're not afraid to provoke, to disturb, to make us squirm in our seats.
It's like they're saying, we're not just going to show you what's pretty and pleasing. We're going to show you the whole picture, even the parts that make you uncomfortable.
And in doing so, they're expanding the very definition of what art can be. It's no longer just about creating objects of beauty to be admired from a distance. It's about using art to engage with the world in all its complexity, to challenge our assumptions, and to spark critical dialogue.
That's such an important point, and it brings us to something that we touched on earlier, the idea that feminist aesthetics isn't just confined to museums and galleries. It's something that extends into our everyday lives.
Yes, and this is where the field of everyday aesthetics comes in, which you as a philosopher might find particularly interesting. It shifts our focus away from those traditional art objects and encourages us to find beauty and meaning in the mundane and the overlooked things that we might not even consider aesthetic at first glance.
Right. It's about finding the extraordinary in the ordinary, appreciating the artistry that's present in those everyday activities that we often take for granted.
Exactly, and this is where feminist perspectives becomes especially relevant, wouldn't you say? After all, so many of these everyday activities, cooking, cleaning, and taking care of children, have historically been associated with women's work, often devalued and dismissed as merely domestic.
Yeah, it's about recognizing that these activities, which are so essential to human life,
Yeah.
also involve creativity and skill and artistry. It's about expanding our definition of what's considered aesthetically valuable and who gets to be considered an artist.
Absolutely. And it's not just about elevating women's work to the status of art. It's about recognizing that art and aesthetics are woven into the very fabric of our daily lives, whether we're preparing a meal or tending a garden or simply arranging our living spaces.
And that's led to some really fascinating philosophical discussions about topics that were previously ignored, like the aesthetics of food or the maternal body or the experience of parenthood.
It's amazing how these seemingly ordinary experiences can become these profound sources of aesthetic contemplation, for example. Philosophers are now exploring those complex sensory experiences of pregnancy and childbirth, recognizing not just the beauty, but also the intensity, the rawness, even the sometimes unsettling aspects of these transformative events.
It's like saying that all of human experience in all its messy glory is worthy of aesthetic exploration.
And recognizing that everyone, regardless of gender, has the capacity for aesthetic experience and creative expression.
So, as we wrap up our deep dive into feminist aesthetics, it's clear that this isn't just some niche area of philosophy or art history. It's a vibrant and ever-evolving field that has these really profound implications for how we think about the world and ourselves and our relationship to art.
Right.
It encourages us to be more critical, more aware, and ultimately more appreciative of the beauty and complexity all around us in both the extraordinary and the everyday.
And it leaves us with some really interesting questions to ponder, given the evolving nature of gender and identity in the 21st century. How will feminist aesthetics continue to challenge and reshape our understanding of art? What new forms of creativity creative expression will emerge, and how can we ensure that everyone has the opportunity to participate in this ongoing conversation about art and beauty and the meaning of human experience. These are just a few of the many thought-provoking questions that feminist aesthetics invites us to explore.